After you're conducting your assessment of Maddie in April, you then again in July spoke to Maddie's mother, Michelle Blair, correct?
Yes.
And father, Stephen Berry, correct?
I had not spoken to the mother until the 9th.
Thank you, until
Yes.
July 9th,
Yes.
correct? Okay, and was July 9th the first time you spoke with the father, Stephen Berry?
Yes.
And did that also occur at the Southfield Kids Talk
Yes.
office? Did you conduct the same type of assessment you did with Alexander Dorsey?
I did.
Did you observe, speak to Maddie before observing him interact with his father?
Briefly, very briefly. Not like I did not sit down with him and interview him. I was just more, we're going to sit with your dad, and he's coming in, and he was comfortable with having the being in a room, alone in the room with his dad, and having the video streamed into the other room while I watched that.
Did you speak to Mr. Well, strike that. Did you do the Marshak activities
Yes.
that you did with Alexander Dorsey?
Yes.
Were those activities explained to Mr. Berry?
Yes.
Did you explain to Mr. Berry that you would be observing his interaction with his son via video?
Yes.
And after that was explained, did you in fact observe the interaction between Mr. Berry and Maddie?
Yes.
Can you explain to us what observations you made?
Well, there were several. One is that initially the father, Mr. Berry, gave Maddie a bear hug when he came in. Maddie came in with his smile, as he does, and so there was a time that I gave them to converse and re-engage before doing the Marshak, and so that conversation began, and Matthew began to talk about a movie and a toy, and Mr. Berry was responding to that, saying, you know, he hadn't gotten the movie, but he was going to go look for it, and talked about a particular toy, an Avenger figure that he wanted, and so Mr. Berry said, I'll look for that, and so they were engaged reciprocally. They certainly, Matthew did not demonstrate any fear. It's hard to exactly know with Maddie how much anxiety he's experiencing, because unlike Gabby, who you can see the anxiety in her, it's more difficult because he has that smile. But he did engage, and they engaged, and then they went into the activities. Mr. Berry did lead those activities. He was engaging with him. He did engage and attempted to engage. So that was a positive. He did communicate a very positive story about, tell me a time when you were born, about when you were born, or about the child when he was born, anyways. And he said, you know, you were born and it was the greatest day of my life. And so that was a very positive statement that I heard. What I saw as it continued was more of the same. There was an engagement process that occurred. I did not see a nurturing process. I did hear that statement about the best day was when you were born. That was a nurturing, but in the interaction, it was much more of a, just kind of a talking and not a physical touch and or engaging in the sense of a nurture emotional piece. All right, I did not see that. I did definitely see willingness to converse and engage. There was some structure. He did praise Maddie once. He built a block structure, I believe it was about the block structure, and he said, good job. So he had some skills in being able to give praise and to engage. I was concerned about the nurturing as well as the structure. And he did build a structure, a block structure, and kind of challenged Maddie to build that. And so that was in the okay range, all right? So
when you say, I want to explore that a little further, when you say the okay range in terms of structure, what are you looking for as the person conducting this evaluation, observing the interaction between the two? What are you looking for in terms of the nurturing and structure aspect?
Well, what I'm looking for in structure is to be able to say, how do we bring Maddie and provide some boundaries for him, all right, so that, you know, oftentimes kids can, without that structure, they can just kind of do their own thing and be very kind of in control of the engagement. And so that's what can happen, and so you're looking for the person, the parent in this case, to take more of a control and kind of structure this, but be flexible, so it's a balance. You don't want to frustrate the child, but you want to direct the child. So that's what we look in structure, and I thought that that wasn't there, certainly as the engagement was. In the nurturing, it's the emotional connection, it's the emotional presence of smiling, of touching, of feeling, of communicating of feelings of happy and sad, and so those are the things that you look for in the nurturing.
And after this interaction that you observed, you conducted an interview with Mr. Berry, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And what were your conclusions or observations of Mr. Berry during this interview?
I was very concerned about a number of things that I identified in the report. One was, and certainly people come in with distrust of a clinician, and I certainly respect that. I began to ask some very probing questions about his childhood and its impact on him, and initially he was quite minimized, said it was fine, and I asked more, and then his intensity level increased in the sense of what I defined as somewhat contentious. All right, why do you have to ask me these questions? And I said, it's to help me understand you as a parent to your son, and he agreed to continue, to allow me to continue those questions, but so it was very clear that there was some defensiveness, there was some concern, and he did communicate eventually some significant experiences that he had had as a child with his mom that were very emotionally difficult for him, and without going into the details of those, just said that this had occurred and he had learned not to let emotions drive his behavior because that could lead to great difficulty. And so that's one of the things that he took away from that childhood. Two things that he said about the kids that concerned me. One was the fact that he said that he was around when Matthew was 2 or 3 in that area, and that when I talked about structure and discipline, he said that Matthew knows now, because when he was 2 or 3, he understood how and what I needed from him in terms of how to behave, and so he knows that now, right? He knows at 8 or 9, he knows that this is what he can do and not do with me based upon when he was around the house when Matthew was 2 and 3.
Okay, and why is that? You said that was concerning or of concern. Why is that?
Well, because of the fact that a child at 2 or 3 does not remember, nor with a significant length of time of 5 to 6 years of a lack of parenting in terms of a day-to-day parenting, that he's going to remember what he can and can't do with his father is really inaccurate. I mean, I can only say it's incorrect because that's not. Now, if he learned fear from his father, he certainly could have that, and I don't know that, and I'm not saying that, but that could stay at 2 or 3. But as far as what were the do's and don'ts of discipline, a child could not in any way recall that. The other thing he said that was concerning was when we talked about the role of Gabby, and initially he communicated something that, you know, Gabby's parenting has been parenting to a degree Matthew, and then he said, well, no, really it's more like a big sister role, that she really wasn't his parent, that she was more like a big sister. And so I said, I challenged that. I said, what I see is that clearly she was the parent. And he said, so I said something to the effect of, you know, that would be really difficult if he was not with Gabby because she has been his parent. And he said that she could come visit him if Matthew was placed in her custody, or she could come live with them, all right, if that was not possible. And so I was just very concerned about him understanding the full impact of the relationship and what it was between Gabby and Maddie.
And do you believe he got that full understanding or comprehended that
No.
relationship?
No.
Do you believe that comprehension of their relationship is vital in terms of Maddie's progress?
Yes.
Did you speak to Mr. Berry about his current living situation and plans if Maddie's returned to him?
Yes, I did.
What did he say?
So I asked him specifically about his living arrangement. He said he was living with somebody, and I said, has this person had any contact with Maddie? And would there be any preliminary visit contact? Because we know that when children are placed with a parent who has a significant other, that significant other plays a huge role in what happens in the relationship and the development of the child. And so he said no, that she had not, and then said, well, I'm only planning to be here temporarily. I'm planning soon to get my own place, and so she wouldn't be a part of it. So that's how he concluded that from initially the statement that he was living with someone.
Did he indicate when he was moving or where he was moving to?
No, he did not.
In terms of the job, did you speak to him, or did he indicate what his plans were in terms of income?
Yes, he had indicated that he had just been to Manpower and that he could start a job within the next week or so as soon as he got his Social Security number. For some reason, and I can't remember, that he had said, I don't have it, and they won't let me start the job without the Social Security number.
Had you also talked to Gabby about Mr. Berry's involvement or role in their family?
Yes.
And what insight did Gabby give you, if any?
Gabby indicated that Mr. Berry had not been a parent to Stephen, that he had been around basically only because of the relationship with the mother, Michelle, that she, meaning Gabby, was very concerned and actually said to her mother, you're way too available for Mr. Berry. He comes for a period of time and then he's gone for 7 or 8 months. And every time you keep letting him back in and he eats the food and does whatever and doesn't contribute. And so she was very articulate about his lack of parenting and or continued presence in his life.
And as in the report with Alexander Dorsey, after your interview section, you have an impression portion of the evaluation, correct?
That's correct.
What were your final impressions regarding Stephen Berry and Matthew Berry?
Well, there were several, and so let me just contextualize this. You know, one of the things about a visit, in observing a visit, is, you know, parents can be engaging, and it was a positive. Certainly Mr. Berry did engage, but that's a snapshot of a history, and it can be very playful. Certainly one of the things I think is important is that at the end of the visit, Maddie started crying, and, you know, when was wondering what that was about. That was unexpected. And then basically he said, you know, I thought I was going to be able to play with your phone today, all right? So that I thought, and I think that that's important to note, all right, that I know the phone has been a part of those visits in the past, and so that was something important. And I think objects for for Maddie right now are important, and he wanted that, and that's part of his distraction, right, to kind of escape. So I say that in terms of contextualizing the visit against the history, where all the information that I have is that Mr. Berry was periodically within the home, and that those periods of time, especially after Maddie was 2 or 3. He was not parenting or supporting Maddie's care. He was not responding to Maddie's needs, but rather it was much more, the contact was about the relationship with the mother. And so given that history, given what I saw, again, I saw engagement, I did not see nurturing, I saw an exaggerated belief by Mr. Berry that he could parent Maddie, and I saw no evidence in the history of what and how he could do that. I wrote in the report, we oftentimes, when we're evaluating parents' ability to parent versus termination of parental rights, use a model called the trans-theoretical model of change, which looks at people and how they make change. And the first stage of that is, I don't have a problem, and the second stage is, I do, but I don't know how to do anything about it. And then there is getting ready to change, and then there's the change itself, and then the ongoing takes, you know, year and a half, 2 years if you really make a commitment to change. I saw that Mr. Berry was in this kind of pre-contemplation, I can just do what I got to do and I can make this happen, versus, yeah, I know Maddie needs something a little more, I have to do something different, but he had no plan in any way, shape, or form for housing, for job, for relationship, and I don't think he understands the significance of the trauma that Maddie has experienced and how that's going to impact him certainly the rest of his life, and hopefully he learns how to manage that, and the necessity of his presence and the intensity of that care in terms of security, safety, and predictability.
And you know that Maddie is placed with his aunt also, is that right? Correct?
Yes.
Okay, and do you believe that to be an appropriate placement for Maddie?
Absolutely.
Beyond appropriate, do you think that's the best placement for Maddie?
Your Honor, I object to the line of questioning. I don't think it's appropriate to compare a placement with a relative to a biological parent. I would say that there's case law to support that it is inappropriate to compare a potential placement with a parent's home, as in Ray Hatcher, 443 Mich 426.
My response is that the court, one of the factors the court has to determine in terms of if a child is placed with a relative, the court has to factor that in terms of best interest. So I believe exploring that, given that the child is placed with a relative, is necessary for a best interest hearing.
Your Honor, may I just respond? The placement with a relative weighs against termination of a parent's rights, and that's the relevance of where the child's placed, not would the child be better off with this relative versus potentially working towards reunification with the father, and I believe that's where the line of questioning is going.
It may be, but under Mason, the placement is relevant as to whether or not termination is in the child's best interest under In re Mason. But in order for the court to consider that in its analysis, the court has to know what the circumstances are surrounding the placement, whether it's working, whether it's likely to be long-term, etc. So the court will allow you some latitude.
And what I'm trying to get at is, in your report, Doctor, you talk about, at least Mr. Berry's report, you talk about, in some respect, Maddie's level of improvement. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, Maddie's level of improvement in what regard?
So when we saw him in July, we did another KBIT, which is the Coffin Brief Intelligence Test, because I wanted to see if potentially there had been some improvement. I was very concerned about the 55, and Maddie doesn't present as a 55. And so in that brief time of 3 months, he had gained 18 points on his IQ test. All right.
That's significant to you?
It is hugely significant. So that was a very significant positive about what I believed was the safety, the security, and the developmental stimulation, which I talked about earlier, that really, again, he's at a crossroad, and every way the system and family can provide support for him is absolutely necessary if he is to recover.
And is it your understanding that his current placement with the aunt, that she wishes to plan permanently for Maddie?
Yes.
In terms of Mr. Berry and his rights, do you believe it's in Maddie's best interest to have his father's rights terminated?
Yes, I do.
Is that for the reasons you stated?
Yes.
moving on now to Michelle Blair. You also conducted an evaluation of Michelle Blair, correct?
That's correct.
That occurred at the jail?
That's correct.
Wayne County Jail, correct?
Yes.
And obviously, given that it was at the jail, you could not observe her interact with her children.
That's correct.
So explain to me what her evaluation consisted of, please.
The evaluation consisted of an interview with her, and specifically talking about the children in terms of Maddie and Gabby, her perceptions of them, her perceptions of the fathers in terms of their availability and their parenting of Maddie and Gabby. So those were the primary questions that we asked in terms of getting at an understanding of that history in the home, as well as understanding Maddie and Gabby from her perspective.
Was there, in getting this history from Blair, was there any information that was given to you that you found relevant in terms of the children's best interest?
Yes, and I have to say that everything that Gabby had communicated to me about what was going on in the house, in terms of the fathers, in terms of the mother's interactions with her, the abuse, with her relationship with Maddie, was confirmed by the mother. It was very consistent that I would say something, or Mom would say something, and I would say, this is what Gabby said, and it just matched. So it really increased Gabby's credibility in terms of, she obviously has not talked to Mother since the removal, and yet their history as they described it were very consistent with one another.
History in terms of what? What match?
With the fathers, with the children.
What specifically about the fathers?
That the fathers were not available, that the fathers were periodic, that Mr. Berry, primary concern was his, I'm going to say relationship, but she would define the coming in and staying at their house, meaning Maddie and the mother and Gabby's house, and that relationship was out of his need of needing a place to stay, or needing money, or needing food, that was the basis of the relationship. And the mother actually brought up, before I had even said anything about Gabby's statement about she was just available to Mr. Berry too easily, she brought that up before I even said that. So, and she talked about Mr. Dorsey in a sense of just not being around, being quite consistent with, as he described himself, as more passive, whereas Mr. Berry was more, as she described, using them and their family to get what he needed.
And in terms of Michelle Blair, you, at the time of her evaluation, were you aware that she was, or strike that, are you now aware that she is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so in terms of her rights to her children, do you have an opinion regarding termination of her rights?
Yes, that termination should occur.
With respect to both children?
Yes.
Judge, may I have one moment?
Yes.
Judge, I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Okay, cross, Mr. Giancelli. Do you need a break after? Are you okay?
No, I can keep going.
Hi, Dr. Henry.
Good morning.
I'm the guardian ad litem for the children. I just have a couple of follow-up questions. You had used the word or the term terror, and I'm not sure if you use that in a clinical sense or just a general understanding of what you meant by that word.
So, terror is not a clinical word. Terror is a reality of you're potentially facing death at any moment and not knowing when it might happen, or you're facing extreme harm and you don't know where it's going to happen, and you are powerless to stop that. So terror is the experience of living, and that trauma is the impact from that terror. Right?
Okay.
So it is not a clinical word, but it is a reality of what I believe both kids experienced.
Okay, so when you had stated both children lived in terror.
Yes.
Is that what you were referring to?
Yes.
And you said, is that a trauma?
So terror is the experience of that, trauma is the impact. Trauma, so that then the memories, the hypervigilance, the dissociation, all of that is because of that, being exposed to that.
Okay. And then, as it relates to Mr. Dorsey and Gabby's relationship, you indicated that you thought that Gabby needed a stable, secure, and a supportive parental figure in her life.
Yes.
And do you believe Mr. Dorsey is able to offer that at this time?
No.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Mr. Devlin?
Good morning, Dr. Henry. I'm Adam Devlin.
Good morning.
I'm the attorney for Mr. Dorsey.
Okay.
So all my questions were related to
Sure.
Mr. Dorsey and Gabrielle. What were your general observations of Alex while you were forming the report?
During, you mean writing the report, or while I was with him?
While you were observing.
I thought, again, as I said, Mr. Dorsey seemed passive. He certainly wanted to be there at the visit. He seemed very uncomfortable in the interaction. Certainly, as I stated, was led by Gabby. So in my interactions with him, I thought he was quite straightforward. He said he wanted the best for Gabby, that he knew she wanted to be a veterinarian. He supported that, that he wanted her to go to college. He supported her staying at the aunt's house. So I thought, certainly outside of, quote, being a parent, he wanted something for the well-being of Gabby.
And in your, I guess, investigation and observations, did you believe that the mother suppressed or interfered with any relationship between Alex and Gabrielle?
Well, from what Mr. Dorsey said to me, he clearly was, I think, afraid or fearful of the mother. And so, right or wrong, I can't determine how much that was, but clearly he stated that he did not want to upset her, and so therefore was non-confrontational. I think just by my sitting with him and interacting with him about what he's experiencing now, my guess would be that that's very accurate in the sense that he tends to be more passive and disengaged and overwhelmed by any kind of significant conflict.
Do you think the terror and heightened anxiety levels in Gabrielle could have limited their relationship?
Say it again, I'm not sure what you
I was asking, the first question was in relation to Mr. Dorsey. So do you think that the heightened terror levels in Gabrielle could have affected her ability to form a relationship with her father?
I think that the heightened terror and the trauma certainly impacted that relationship, absolutely. I think that what potentially could have been there, if he had been available, would have been to reduce the trauma, to help her get through that, which did not happen. But certainly because she was so fearful, she learned to disengage from other relationships, and she said that herself as a survival. But given the potential of what could have happened by an active parent, I think is what I'm really most concerned about.
Now that the mom is incarcerated, do you think that there is a better opportunity for them to have a growing relationship?
I think potentially as time happens, and again, remember that Gabby is healing, that in the future that could happen. It's not going to happen right now, but I think that when she's 20 or 25 or whatever, that certainly could happen. I think that her need will change over time, and she may have that need to connect to him.
Do you believe that Gabby's correctly processing her emotions?
I think she's made significant progress.
She's still internalizing.
Yes, she is, and she's going to internalize the rest of her life. All right, that's her primary coping. But we're hoping that she can find those safe places to process rather than just holding it.
Would a reliving of the events surrounding, I guess, the need for these termination proceedings would that have a deleterious effect on her progress?
Say it again, I'm not sure your question.
Would her having to relive all the issues surrounding determinations and the reason why we're here, would that have a deleterious effect on the progress she is making?
Yes, I think that, one of my concerns is how does the system potentially re-expose her and overwhelm her with stress as she's trying to manage and to heal from the trauma that she's already experienced. And so that is my concern, that she's put in situations that have to occur that don't look at her well-being and the impact of that.
You reported that Gabby wants to make friends and enjoys seeing her cousins. Is that correct?
Yes.
How did you arrive at this conclusion?
Because she told me. She told me. And one of the good things she said about that, which again, you talk about her progress, she said in a look that was very positive and a smile on her face to say, I've actually made 2 friends at school. And so I thought that was very important.
Do you believe these family and emotional connections are important to Gabby?
They're the foundation of everything.
Would Gabby have been able to create normal relationships under the influence of the terror that she was subjected to?
No.
Does the disassociation that you discussed about her, does that affect making friends and forming relationships?
Yes.
Reported that Alex hopes that Gabby will learn to feel comfortable around him and know that he is there for her. Is that correct?
Yes.
How did you arrive at this conclusion?
Because he communicated that to me, and I think just from being with him, I think that was genuine.
Okay, that was going to be my next question.
Yes.
How did that conclusion and the genuineness of that conclusion affect your report?
It shared, as I spoke earlier, I think that the availability of that potential relationship in the future could be important. And so, but that's to be determined by Gabby. And I think that the neglect that she experienced, certainly she has to process his lack of protection, which all kids have to do when the non-offending parent doesn't protect. That's a betrayal, and I think she's not at that place yet. But I think that's going to have to happen, and if that can happen, then maybe in the future that she could be comfortable with the relationship.
And then how did Alex's, statements or expressions to you that he cannot rush into a relationship with Gabby, how did that affect you?
I think that it's obviously communicated in the report. I think it just, again, communicates that he recognizes and wants what's best for Gabby. And I thought I certainly heard that from him. And I'm sure that he's struggling as to what that's going to look like. And right now, it's really under Gabby's control, given her age. And so I think that it affected my perception of him in the sense of I really think he does want, but doesn't understand what she's got to go through in order to potentially get there.
But you think that sentiment is genuine?
Yes.
Your report indicated that Alex is supportive of Gabby remaining at her great aunt and great uncle's home. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did he tell you that?
Yes.
Do you think that's genuine?
Yes.
Would it true then to say that Alex recognizes putting Gabby's needs over his own immediate needs?
I can't say that, all right? I cannot say that. I can say that he wants the best for her. I can't say he's willing to put her needs before his. I do not know that. His history would say no, but I think he wants what's best for Gabby.
You mentioned his history. In all of your, observations and interview with him, did you take into account what you knew about his history? Did you notice a positive trend in his desires and actions towards Gabby?
Since the removal, yes.
Yes.
All right. Prior to that, no.
You report that he wants to support her, is that correct?
Yes.
And you believe that's genuine?
Yes.
Well, Judge, at this point, I've let it go on. What essentially asking the witness to do is to make credibility determination. That's for the court to make. He can opine as to whether, or make statements as to what the father told him, and if he had any concerns about the father after, based on his conversations, but asking him to say, is he telling you the truth or not, is not appropriate.
Well, he can't ask if he's telling Dr. Henry the truth, but certainly Dr. Henry's been qualified as an expert, so Dr. Henry can give his opinion, or I guess his prognosis, on what value, if any, the relationship may have. So to the extent that's what you're asking, you can ask him that.
I'm only asking is whether or not in his clinical opinion that he believes Alex is making a genuine effort with these statements. He's not just using these as words to try to get his own way in this proceeding.
You can answer that. Oh, you can answer that.
So I would say, from my judgment, and this is strictly a judgment, that I would say he does want Gabby to succeed, and he wants to support her however he can, knowing that history and knowing that she has to decide how that's going to be.
You reported that Alex's behavior is consistent with a parent that lacks understanding of his daughter's strengths and needs. Is that correct?
Yes.
But you've also reported that he wants, generally what's best for her, that he's interested in her well-being, and that he's supportive of her decisions. Is that correct?
Yes.
So, would it be safe to say that he's trying to arrive at the proper conclusions with regard to Gabby?
Yes.
And you had mentioned in, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name, the MIM report.
Yes.
Report that he's desirous but lacks the necessary skills. That's correct?
Yes.
Do you believe those skills can be taught to him?
At this point, no. I don't think with Gabby. I think that's done, given her age, given her need to be able to heal. I do not think that that's going to happen. I think that that might be different with a younger child. I think that could be taught, but the place between Gabby and he is not 5 years old, and so she has different needs than a 5-year-old, and so I don't think those skills can be taught to him at this point.
You concluded that there's potential that his support of her decisions could lead to increased desire to have a relationship. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, say it again?
I said you concluded that there is a potential that his support of her decisions could lead to an increased desire to have a relationship.
Yes.
Why did you conclude that?
Basically, because as I've been describing, I think that there is the potential, if he continues to want to be supportive and available to her, that could happen.
And prior to your testimony earlier with the Attorney General, you had concluded in your subsequent report, Mr. Dorsey, that you were not in favor of termination, correct?
At that point, I, quote, said, she's 18 years old, didn't even know if you could terminate. I still don't know if you can terminate, all right? But certainly the grounds are there for termination. My decision was based on the fact that she was 18 and didn't think that was possible.
You also testified that there's no potential value of termination?
In terms of if you're looking at it from a legally, I, again, didn't think that that could happen.
If this court were to terminate Mr. Dorsey's relationship for parental rights, do you think that he and Gabby could have a relationship on the other side of that termination?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you think that would no effect?
That as far as if Gabby wanted a relationship with her father, the, quote, legality of that would be nil because of the age of the child. Certainly at 19, 20, if she wants to see her father, it doesn't matter what had happened. In terms of legally, she wanted to pursue that could happen.
But from a psychological standpoint, would it have an effect?
No, I don't think it would have an effect.
Do you believe that, in your observations of Alex, do you believe that he loves her?
I guess I can't say that. I can say that he really wants to support her and wants the best for her, and so I guess I would leave that to you to decide that.
No questions, John.
All right, Ms. Anderson.
Both you lawyers will not be successful.
Hold on, Ms.
Trying to
Blair.
blame them.
Hold
Keep
on, Ms.
playing the blame game. That's your only focus.
Hold on, Ms. Blair. All right, Ms. Anderson.
Thank you. Dr. Henry, you assessed Matthew on April 8th of this year?
Yes?
And did you fully assess him again on July 9th?
No?
So the tests that you ran were just on April 8th?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And April 8th would have been about 2 weeks from the time that Matthew was removed from his mother's home in that environment, correct?
Don't know exactly the time. I couldn't tell you. I know it was within a month. I do not know this
Were you
exactly.
aware that the mother was arrested on or about March 24th of this year?
I did not know the exact date. No, I did not know that.
Okay, so, but you knew it had been just 2 to 3 weeks?
Yes, right.
Did you take into account the short amount of time that Matthew had been removed from his mother in that environment in any of the results that you observed or obtained?
Are you talking about the testing results?
Correct.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't change the results, but in the report it talks about his potential is unknown. And so when we're looking at this, it gives us a kind of a baseline to say, here's what is. And so the hope is, as I had said earlier, that the long-term trajectory will be much more positive.
When you evaluated or assessed Matthew on April 8th, about how long did that take?
That took about 2.5 hours, I would say.
So that was engaging Matthew in various tests and questions for 2.5 hours?
Yes,
And he is 8 years old?
yes.
Okay.
And it also involves play, so we did lots of things, so it wasn't just testing.
All right, and what time did the evaluation begin, if you recall?
We did Gabby initially and Maddie after that, so I couldn't tell you exactly when. It was probably noonish.
Okay, and to your knowledge, was Matthew in the waiting area while you were working with
Yes.
Gabby?
Yes,
And how long did you work with Gabby?
about 2 hours.
All right, so Matthew had been sitting for a couple of hours,
Mhm.
correct?
He had been out and about with his aunt and uncle. They had been outside. They had done a variety of things.
All right, do you know if Matthew ate anything before the interview?
I believe they went out and got something to eat.
You said part of your assessment included speaking with the current caregiver, a great aunt, Miss Gordon.
Yes,
All right. And did Miss Gordon tell you that as far as Matthew's behavioral and emotional history, that quote, Matthew, well, she said Matthew, did you say that Matthew's great aunt did not have any concerns about Matthew's behavior at this time, and that she felt he was happy and can display a range of emotions?
yes,
So Ms. Gordon did not, on April 8th, have concerns about Matthew's behaviors at that time, correct?
that's correct.
When you performed the child behavioral checklist, was that also based upon Ms. Gordon's observations?
Yes,
All right, and you found nothing clinically significant regarding the child behavioral checklist, correct?
that's correct. Those are all from the aunts filling those out.
right.
There was nothing clinically significant at all.
With regards to testing Matthew for ADHD, in the ADHD system scale, you also found nothing clinically significant?
That's correct.
And again, that was based upon the reporting of Ms. Gordon?
Yes,
When you tested Matthew for visual motor processing, he was in the average range, is that correct?
yes,
When you also tested him, you indicated that he demonstrated appropriate conversational skills,
yes,
and that's despite the low verbal IQ?
yes,
All right. You also noted that his sensory processing was typical performance?
and those are from the aunt as well.
Okay.
She filled out that questionnaire.
All right. And did you also indicate in your report that Matthew was able to identify and express a variety of feelings verbally?
Yes,
When you assessed Matthew for the child associative checklist, you found nothing clinically significant, correct?
that's correct.
So what does that tell you?
Well, it tells that he's not displaying symptoms according to the aunt who filled this out. I didn't fill that out. The aunt filled that out. Again, that would suggest dissociative.
Did you ask or where someone asked Matthew about his favorite things and what he likes to do?
Yes,
And to you report typical 8-year-old things such as children's TV shows,
Yes.
video games, food?
he did report Grand Theft Auto, which was not typical for an 8-year-old boy, but other than that, he talked about those things.
And he also talked about a cat
Yes,
that he had at home, a pet cat. You also performed the trauma symptom checklist for young kids,
yes,
and that partly measures post-traumatic stress disorder,
Yes.
correct? And you weren't able to measure that.
I'm not sure what you mean, I wouldn't, let me look at that. Right.
Your report indicates, find a page, that'll refresh your recollection.
Yes, that is on page, doesn't have a page number, so.
Right.
But I see it, yes, anxiety, depression, anger, PTSD, yes.
Okay, and you indicated you weren't able to measure that.
So when there's a low,
I'm just asking you.
yes,
Is that what
right,
you-
right, this is from the aunt again, all right, her scores. And
Because
so
you felt her scores didn't match up with
it
what
didn't, no, statistically it doesn't match up, all right?
statistically, okay.
All right. There wasn't any subjective on my part, that's statistical.
But you did indicate on the ADHD system rating scale that the scores were much lower than anticipated given by the aunt.
Yes,
Okay. Your report indicates that Matthew was age appropriate in terms of sexual development.
yes,
In terms of your indicating that Matthew suffered neurodevelopmental harm, you agree that that's a subjective finding by the evaluator?
well, no, not based on testing. I mean, there are some neurodevelopmental delays, there's no question about those, all right?
Well, did you
And so-
indicate in your report that there was some subjectiveness to your evaluation?
There's always subjective, again, looking at understanding trauma, what it does to children, and so you take your clinical experience and your experience with other children and look at the history of what has happened to him or her in making those. So yes, absolutely there's clinical assessments, but testing is, there are neurodevelopmental delays. That's not my subjective opinion. Now, that doesn't mean, and its report states, that those couldn't be corrected in the future given supports, as I mentioned earlier.
I went ahead and numbered these pages, and I'm looking at what I numbered as page 9 of your assessment from April, Matthew, and under the traumagenic impact of maltreatment, the rating scale.
Yes,
Okay, you indicated it's completed by the evaluator, that's you.
yes,
And you write it is a subjective measure.
yes,
Okay.
that is.
And then on the next page, you have comments that I take to summarize your opinion from the scale.
Yes,
Okay, because it's immediately following
Yes.
the results of the scale test. And you're indicating, that's where you indicate in your report that Matthew's neurodevelopment has been harmed, correct?
yes.
All right. You talked about Matthew's improvement in his IQ from the April meeting to the July meeting.
That's correct.
So you did do some testing of him in July to
That's the
determine-
only testing we did.
Okay,
That's the only testing.
all right. And did you indicate in your initial evaluation in April that the IQ delays that Matthew was having were likely due to educational, not being in school, basically?
Not being school and stimulation within the environment, normal kinds of
Okay,
things,
but
yes.
Your report indicated it was likely due to educational
Yes.
delays. And so, do you know if Matthew was put in school?
Yes.
From the time you met him in April until July?
And he's been receiving tutoring as well.
All right. So do you believe that it was his, that his schooling helped improve his IQ?
I believe two things. One, it's the safety of the environment within which he has been. And two, it's been the educational, developmental exposure that will increase that. So I think it's a combination. It's not just educational, because if he's not safe, he's not going to learn.
Right. I agree. But would you also agree that in your report, you only indicated his overall intelligence is in the lower extreme, but some of these delays are likely due to lack of academic exposure,
Mhm.
correct?
Yes.
All right.
But certainly the conclusions talk
Well,
about it much more globally. Yes.
Thank you. You answered the question.
Yes.
Thank you. You talked about Matthew having a fragmented memory and kind of going from one idea to the next.
Yes.
And would you say that's unusual for an 8-year-old?
Not an 8-year-old who's been traumatized.
An 8-year-old who hasn't been in school, who hasn't had social interaction?
I'm not sure what you're trying to say, ma'am.
I'm asking whether or not you found the fragmented memory to be explained by the lack of education, the lack access to education, the lack of being around others other than the immediate family, and just the fact of being 8.
I would
Well,
say,
Judge, I'm going to object at this point because that's a compound question. Is the fragmented memory just because he was 8, or is it because he wasn't in school? I mean, you may have different answers for that.
I don't think I got it either, so could you restate it, Ms. Anderson?
Okay. How would you explain the fragmented memory?
so we know that children who are traumatized have fragmented memories. So their film in their head, their movie in the head that they show from what happened before, doesn't have a whole movie. It has clips, little segments, all right? It's very well documented in the research. And so fragmented memories here then affects your ability to consistently put a coherent whole together. So they tend to be tangential, all right? You're here, and then you're here, and then you're here. And certainly I've spent many times with 8-year-olds, all right? And some of any kid developmentally is 8 versus 16. However, for Matthew, given his history, given what I experienced, to me, it is clear that that's a fragmented memory given the innumerable traumatic memories that he has.
And that's something that would change over time, assuming he's in a healthy environment?
That will not change unless he gets therapy to address and to put a narrative together. That's what trauma therapy is about.
And you recommended trauma-based therapy?
Yes.
For Matthew, correct? And you conveyed that to Ms. Gordon, the aunt?
Yes.
And do you know if he's in therapy?
Yes.
All right. And have you received any therapy reports?
They wouldn't send them to us, all right? They would send them to the department, but I have not received any.
And I believe you also recommended that Matthew get into some sporting activities?
Yes.
Do you know if that was done?
I know he's at camp this week and participating, so I would assume that that will continue.
You talked about the importance of Gabrielle in Matthew's life and her role as she relates to Matthew. They're 10 years apart, correct?
Yes.
And you indicated that Gabrielle had an average IQ?
Yes.
Did you retest her?
No.
When you saw her in July?
No.
Do you know what grade level Gabrielle is at?
She is somewhere between the 11th or 12th grade.
Okay, so she could conceivably graduate within a year?
Conceivably.
And did you speak to Gabrielle at all about her intentions to go to college?
Yes,
What did she tell you?
she really would like to go to college.
Did she indicate where she'd like to go?
Not at this point.
Did she indicate that she'd like to go to community college and stay
She-
at the aunt's house, or go to live on campus somewhere?
She did not communicate either.
But she used the words, "I want to go to college."
Yes, very clearly.
You talked about the importance of Matthew seeing Gabby daily, correct?
Yes.
Yes, okay. And you recognize that if Gabrielle goes away to college in a year's time, that most likely won't happen.
If she goes away to college, it wouldn't happen every day, no.
Now, Miss Gordon is Miss Blair's aunt, correct?
Great aunt.
She's-
Well, it's great aunt to the children.
Right, but
Yes.
she's Miss Blair's aunt.
Yes.
And great aunt to Matthew.
Yes.
All right. And did Miss Gordon tell you that she was aware that her niece, Miss Blair, had been emotionally impaired and mood disorders all her life?
She communicated that she was concerned about her emotional and mental well-being, yes.
But did Miss Gordon tell you that she knew that her niece, Miss Blair,
I will have to read it in here specifically, and if you could point it out exactly to what, I can't remember exact words. I know that she had indicated that she had concerns about mental and emotional
it's on
health.
the first page of your report.
Okay.
Is for clarification, which report?
Oh, from the April,
April 8th, yes.
Right, you see where you
Mhm.
indicate right in
Yes,
that report
yes.
that Matthew's mom is emotionally impaired and a struggle with mood disorder her whole life?
Yes,
All right, and then on the next page, Ms. Gordon went on to say that she had that children would spend 2 weekends a month with her.
Yes.
Up until a couple of years ago when Ms. Blair stopped contact.
yes.
All right. And did Ms. Gordon indicate to you that she knew of 2 prior CPS substantiated referrals for physical abuse on the children?
At this point in time, I am going to object in terms of relevancy. Whatever in the report can take, but if we're using this line of questioning to assume or to state in some way that the aunt is somehow to blame, she's not a person who had rights to these children. The blame goes from DHHS to the aunt. I mean, when does it come back to her own client?
Your Honor, if I could just respond.
The question is, so what does it have to do with best interests, whether the aunt knew or not?
Well, in questioning by petitioner's counsel, it was brought up about how good things are at the aunt's home and how the aunt would be able to provide stability and an appropriate, healthy home. So my line of questioning is going to her ability to protect these children.
I don't understand how she could protect children she didn't have a right to protect.
Well, the petitioner is asking that Ms. Gordon be placed in that permanent position. And they pointed out in the examination how healthy and how great everything is at the aunt's house. So I think I have a right to question the aunt's ability to properly
Her
parent.
abilities. And you, excuse me, and you can do that as long as we don't get into whether or not the aunt's lack of knowledge somehow bears upon Mr. Berry's lack of knowledge, because we're way past that junction.
Yes, I agree.
But
I'm
if
going
it's
to-
limited just to the aunt's ability to care for the children, then you can ask it.
So I guess my line of questioning, Doctor, goes towards, do you have any concerns about Ms. Gordon's ability to parent when she knew of Ms. Blair's being emotionally impaired all her life, having mood disorders her whole life, having 2 prior CPS referrals for physical abuse of the girls, and having the children cut off from her unexplainably 2 years ago, and not seeing them more often?
I guess
Any
I'll,
concern about?
let me frame it this way. We work with innumerable grandparents who know that their children are emotionally impaired, but who have no rights to their children and are very, very concerned. And so the fact that she knew those things, I in no way see that as a concern. She was concerned. She has no rights. I can tell you story after story after story of relatives who've been concerned, but because they have no rights, that they can't do anything. So that, to me, in no way reflects on her ability to care, nor protect, nor provide for those children.
You yourself have been a protective services worker, correct?
Yes.
For many years, right?
Yes.
Do you know what Ms. Gordon does in the profession?
I believe she was or still is a police officer.
She's a police officer?
Yes.
Okay. And so you don't think she would have known she could have called protective services?
Well, Judge, again, is this Ms. Gordon's best interest hearing, or is this her client's?
It's sustained.
All right, I'll move on here. You indicated that Matthew smiled most of the time you saw him, correct?
All the time.
All the time?
Yes.
And you felt that was a defense mechanism?
Yes.
Did you ask the aunt, Ms. Gordon, if Matthew smiles all the time when she's around him at home?
Yes.
And what did she say?
Yes.
That he permanently walks around
Not
with a
permanently,
smile?
I mean, but when he meets people, engages with people, he's smiling all the time. You know, he certainly can get mad, he certainly can be sad. I'm not saying when permanent, but I'm saying that that's his mode of coping and survival, is that.
But could he also be smiling because he's happy to see someone?
He does that indiscriminately, all right? And that doesn't mean that he isn't happy to see somebody. Yes, he's happy to see somebody, but determining that smile that's what it is different because of his experiences and how he's learned to survive. That's what I'm trying to communicate.
So he may be smiling, but not for the reasons that we may think?
Yes, absolutely.
You indicate that Matthew's in a crossroads in his development and he needs predictability and consistency. Don't all kids benefit from that?
I guess maybe you didn't read the report in terms of the magnitude of what this child has experienced. He's not a typical 8-year-old child.
But
And
don't all
he
kids
is,
benefit?
Judge, I would ask this,
Let him finish.
I would move to strike as not responsive. My question was, don't all kids benefit from having predictability and consistency?
and she did not phrase it as a yes or no question. She left the room open for him to answer in an open-ended fashion, and that's what he's choosing to
So
do.
let him finish his answer. What is the remainder of your answer, Dr. Henry?
that the magnitude of, at any age, a child could be at a crossroad. This is so significant given the magnitude of his trauma and what he's experienced, that this is a crucial, that's going to affect the rest of his life in terms of this decision about his future.
And the information that Gabrielle told you about Mr. Berry not supporting the family financially, where does she get that information from? She's a child.
Gabby was not a child. Gabby played the role of a parent. She was intimately acquainted with the financial status of that family, the rent money of that family, every detail. She was the parent to Gabby. And so she knew where the money was, she knew how much was there, who contributed. So clearly she was not in the role, even though, I mean, she was in that role even though she was a child.
Regarding the assessment of my client and his interaction with his son, would you say that Mr. Berry was appropriate with Matthew during their time together?
Yes,
You mentioned that Matthew, or that Mr. Berry gave his son a bear hug when he first
Yes.
saw his son, and Matthew didn't shy away from that?
No.
correct? Matthew didn't appear afraid of his father at
No.
all, correct? You You indicated that throughout your assessment of the father and son, there was good eye contact between father and son throughout.
Yes.
You indicated that my client actually led the MIM activities, correct?
Yes.
And that's something you wanted him to do?
Yes.
So it was appropriate that he did that?
Yes, absolutely.
And he engaged with Matthew in those activities?
Yes.
For instance, the building of a robot out of blocks, I
Yes.
believe? And when Matthew had trouble with that, how did Mr. Berry respond?
He responded appropriately.
He said, I'll help you with
Yes.
that. And Mr. Berry also colored pictures with his son, correct?
Yes.
And they talked about things. You said before the assessment started about movies and toys.
Yes.
That was kind of normal father-son talk, at least at that point.
I'm not sure it's normal father-son talk, just because they don't see each other, so it was much more of inquiry by Matthew, and so, but it wasn't inappropriate.
And Mr. Berry described to his son that his son's birth was the greatest day of his life.
Yes.
And in terms of providing structure, you had some concerns about that, but wasn't it an appropriate boundary to set by not allowing the son to have the energy drink because it's just for adults?
That, to me, was just common sense, right? To say you have a large energy drink and you don't give it to your 8-year-old son. So I didn't see that as structuring. I saw that as just common sense that you wouldn't give that to an 8-year-old.
And he also indicated to his son, at least at this visit, that they wouldn't be playing with his phone, correct?
Yes.
And that's something Matthew wanted, and Mr. Berry said
And I
no.
believe, and I'm 90% sure that I said to Mr. Berry that we're not going to use the phone in this. We're going to do the MIM and activities, so I did not want the phone a part of the interaction.
Now, you're not a treating therapist to this family, correct?
That's correct.
You had just met this family, you met Matthew twice and Mr. Berry once, correct?
I've met Matthew 3 times.
3 times?
Yes.
Okay. But you're not providing ongoing therapy?
No,
or
I'm
any
not.
therapy to this
No,
family, right?
I'm not.
All right. So you were a stranger to Mr. Berry when he met you?
Yes.
All right. And you were asking him to delve into his most personal family history of his own, correct?
I wouldn't say the most personal. It was personal. But yes, no, there were questions that are relevant to understanding how someone parents related to their childhood. So those are personal in the sense of needing to know some of that, yes.
And he did answer your questions eventually?
Yes, as I said, he had stopped, asked why, obviously was concerned, but I kept going and he did answer those questions, yes.
And when Mr. Berry was visiting with his son Matthew, Mr. Berry knew that you were viewing
Yes.
from some other room?
Yes.
correct? So he knew that he was being watched?
Yes.
And he parented? Okay. And do you think that would make a parent nervous to know
It
that
certainly
he's
could.
being not only watched but judged?
Certainly could make someone nervous, yes.
You indicated you didn't see much emotion from my client, but he did tear up or cry with you when he was discussing with you what happened to his son?
Yes.
So that's certainly emotional.
Yeah, and I defined it, I put that in there for a reason, because it was an emotional piece that he teared up at that point, yes.
So even though you were a stranger, he cried in front of you when he talked about what happened to his son?
Yes.
And Mr. Berry is very concerned, or expressed concern to you about losing his parental rights to Matthew, correct?
Yes,
And he asked you about that during your assessment of him, correct?
that's correct.
And Mr. Berry expressed to you some some recognition of the horrific situation that his sons were put in when he lived with the mother. Correct?
Yes.
And Mr. Berry recognized the importance that Gabrielle plays in Matthew's life, at least to some degree.
Certainly not to the degree that I thought was necessary to really understand it. There was some recognition of the big sister, but I can't imagine how he could not recognize that she was the parent and she was parenting Gabby when he had had contact with them.
Well, didn't Mr. Berry say to you at first that Gabrielle was parenting Matthew?
Yes.
He said, and then he
Changed
went on
that.
to say, well, they're really sister and brother. How do you know he wasn't just letting you know that he knew technically your sister and brother?
Because he was talking about role. I was talking about role. I wasn't talking about person.
That's what you were talking about.
Yes.
How do you know that's how Mr. Berry interpreted it?
It seemed to me very clear that it was parenting role that I was talking about. I can't know for sure, but certainly I was very articulate about the role she played.
And Mr. Berry seemed to recognize his son's needs in terms of needing to provide for his son physically, emotionally, financially. He expressed that.
He expressed that to me, yes.
And did Mr. Berry indicate that Ms. Blair forwarded his visiting his son after he was released from prison in 2013?
Yes, he said that.
What's your understanding that would happen in terms of Matthew's placement if the court were to not terminate Mr. Berry's rights today?
I'm not sure what your question is, ma'am.
What is your understanding of what would happen to Matthew's placement if the court were not to terminate Mr. Berry's rights today? What's your understanding of what would happen to Matthew?
I would assume that he would just remain at the aunt's home until a permanent decision was made.
Okay. So you understand that if the court didn't terminate Mr. Berry's rights today, Matthew could become a temporary court ward?
Yes.
And that the court could order him, Mr. Berry, to complete a treatment plan?
Yes.
And the treatment plan would consist of making sure that he has appropriate housing for his son? Would that be your expectation?
I think there would be a lengthy treatment plan to say how is he going to do consistency, predictability, safety, security within each of the areas of financially, emotionally, educationally. So I would think it would be a lengthy plan.
Okay, so it would include housing, income, therapy,
Yes.
parenting classes, that sort of thing, correct?
Yes.
And Matthew could stay with his aunt and Gabrielle while Mr. Berry were working on a treatment plan, correct?
That's not my decision, but I would assume that that would be made.
Well, I know the aunt says she's willing to plan for
Yes.
Matthew long-term. Do you know if the aunt's willing to plan for Matthew short-term?
Yes.
She is?
Yes.
Okay. All right, so Matthew could stay in his current placement even if Mr. Berry's rights were not terminated today?
I would believe so. I can't say that
All right.
dogmatically, but I can say confidently.
All right, you said earlier that Matthew may be smiling, but not for the reasons we think, correct?
Yes.
Now, you also said that Matthew was crying at the end of the visit, correct?
Yes.
And you said he was crying because his father didn't have him play with the phone that
Yes.
day. How do you know that's really why Matthew was crying, and that he wasn't crying because he was leaving his father?
Because the first thing he said was, I thought I was going to be able to play with the phone today when he started crying. Okay? He didn't say, gee, Dad, I have to leave you. It was, I thought I was going to be able to play with the phone today.
Well, okay, so he expressed a reason for why he was crying,
Yes.
correct? And you're taking that reason to be exactly why he was crying.
I believe that's why he was crying, yes.
But you don't take necessarily why he's smiling to be the reason why he's smiling.
Yes.
Okay. you foresee Matthew's emotional and educational, having emotional, educational consistency, would that continue to improve him in terms of his cognitive ability?
Yes.
And his overall happiness?
Yes, absolutely.
And did Mr. Berry seem to recognize that Matthew needs special help in school? Did you talk about that?
I'm not sure we talked about that specifically. We talked about some of the delays. I don't recall specifically saying, that he needs, but we talked about that. I may have, I can't recall that specifically.
But Mr. Berry made it clear to you that he'd like to retain his parental rights?
Yes.
You indicated that Matthew's neural development could be improved over time?
Yes.
And how would that happen?
Because of stimulation, safety, the brain works on safety.
Okay.
And so accessing higher levels of thinking really demands all the things that I've talked about in terms of safety and predictability, and then they can make significant gains given the safety of an environment and relationship.
Did you ask Matthew how he feels about his father?
I can't recall specifically. I did not ask him the same questions that I asked Gabby because of her age, and what I believe is he has a hard time. I didn't want to overwhelm him. I don't ask kids, where they want to live at 8 years old. All right, puts too much pressure on them. So he was happy to see his dad. So I did not probe into that with him.
You said that Matthew was happy to see his dad. Were you checking for any bonding between the two?
In a visit, you begin to see, as I talked about engagement, I was obviously explained concerns about some nurturing that needed to be there, some structuring that needed to be there. I think that at this point, I did not experience this parent-child bond. I felt comfort that he felt comfortable with his father, that he was able to engage with his father. He wasn't afraid of his father, but the significance of that bond I did not see.
Did you ask Matthew whether or not he wants to continue to visit with his father?
No.
You didn't talk
No.
about that? So we really don't know Matthew's position in terms of how much...
No, and I don't think we can really know, even if Matthew said, I want to see my dad, which my guess is he very well might, all right? This part of this relational Matthew that engages and has that, the depth of that relationship is different than wanting to see his dad.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Ms. Burns, you have some questions, correct?
Yeah.
We're going to take a little break. Well, Dr. Hammond needs a break, so let's take a 5-minute break. 10-minute break.
10-minute break. All right, thank you.